Hello, and welcome to our 19th and final class on David. Let's begin with a quick review. Last time, we walked beside David as he faced his own death and recognized that no life is complete without death. The people around David viewed his dying as either a problem to solve, an opportunity to grasp, or responsibility to fulfill, rather than a sacred time to treasure. As Christians, we know that death will give way to life. This is our final reflection on David's life. As we've seen, David is a complex and contradictory character. David dealt with fear and enemies, whether when he faced Goliath or was escaping Saul. He did this by looking to God for his protection. At other times, David's morals and manners leave a lot to be desired, as the story of David, Bathsheba, and Uriah teach us. At the beginning of his life, it seemed David's triumphs were greater than his tragedies, but by the end of his life, tragedy loomed large. There's a tension between David's loyalty to and abiding trust in God and the failures David had as a husband, father, and leader. So it seems reasonable to ask, with all his challenges, missteps, and failures, why is David called a man after God's own heart? I believe the answer lies in the fact that David's life was oriented in one direction. His life was oriented to God. David never ran after other gods, and even when he got sideways with God, David always returned. For David, God was real, not some abstract idea or a fuzzy feeling. David believed in God, prayed to God, talked to God. God was personal for David. He called God by name, and God was ever present to David. Everything David saw, tasted, touched, heard, or smelled eventually led him to the truth of God's presence. David made himself at home in God's story. 2 Samuel chapter 22 is a song of thanksgiving at the end of 2 Samuel that's repeated again as Psalm 18. The Lord is my rock, my fortress and my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call to the Lord, who is worthy of praise, and I have been saved from my enemies. David praises God for being his protector, his refuge, his stronghold. With God by his side, David could do anything. The cords of death entangled me. The torrents of destruction overwhelmed me. The cords of the grave coiled around me. The snares of death confronted me. In my distress, I called to the Lord. I cried to my God for help. When David faced his enemies, including death, he experienced God moving heaven and earth to save him. He reached down from on high and took hold of me. He drew me out of deep waters. He rescued me from my powerful enemy, from my foes who were too strong for me. They confronted me in the day of my disaster, but the Lord was my support. Why did God deliver this morally suspect, spiritually challenged, imperfect man? He brought me out into a spacious place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. God delighted in David. He looked at David as a loving father looks at his child, sometimes applauding how David faithfully solved a problem, sometimes shaking his head at David's arrogance and pride. Even at David's worst, God didn't abandon him, but disciplined him and coaxed him back into their relationship. God delighted in seeing David succeed in the life and the call that he gave him. David lived the gospel. The good news is that God did for David what David couldn't do for himself. David lived under the Philistine culture of war and violence and the Canaanite morality of promiscuity, power, and pride. In other words, David lived under human conditions. And in those conditions of greed, violence, thirst for power and control, God equipped David to live his life. David dealt with sin and suffering, friends and knuckleheads, beauty and love. God used every circumstance of David's life to bring his kingdom just a little closer. David made God visible to the people around him, sometimes because he followed God's voice really well, sometimes because although he strayed from God's will, he repented and returned. Each time, David made God's grace and love visible. David's life is a reminder that we don't have to get it all together, figure everything out, or be a perfect person in order to be in a relationship with God. Instead, we enter in a relationship with God, and from there, we embark upon a lifetime of learning and training in God's ways of justice and mercy and love. David's story immerses us in the reality of life with God as ordinary men and women, with all our contradictions and challenges and celebrations. And when we immerse ourselves in God, when we pursue and are pursued by our loving Father, we can experience the joy and exhilaration David did, regardless of our current circumstances. With your help, I can advance against a troop. With my God, I can leap over a wall. I love the image of David running, coming up to a wall, and then effortlessly vaulting over it and running forward to pursue life. Running to Goliath, running away from Saul, running to round up the sheep, running to meet Jonathan, running beside the Ark of the Covenant, running to the throne of Israel. Always moving, never standing still, never simply strolling along sedately. This is an authentic, everyday spirituality, a rich and vibrant life of faith. It's the abundant life Jesus promised. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. David lived an abundant life with God. I pray that we all do the same. Thank you for joining us in this study of David. May you continue to grow as a woman or a man after God's own heart. And as always, keep the faith.